Hello, it's Chino here. If you like aggressive openings, you're in the right place. Today I'd like to explore the Alekhine-Chatard Gambit after e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, e5, knight f to d7, and now the key move h4. Now in this position, white is offering a gambit on g5, but in this video we'd like to explore the variations where black declines the gambit. We'll look at the moves f6, castles kingside, h6, and a6. Now starting with move f6, white simply plays queen to h5 check, and after a move like g6, pawn takes f6, knight takes f6, queen to e2 should be better for white. Now going back a couple of moves after f6, queen h5 check, g6, pawn takes f6. Instead of knight takes f6, black can play g times h5, but white plays pawn takes e7, maintaining equality, but with a much better pawn structure. So we see f6 doesn't quite work for black. Instead, going back to the main position, black can play castles kingside. But here I think bishop d3 or queen g4 give white some initiative. Queen g4 is my preferred move when already black's threatening bishop to h6. So for example, a move like c5 would allow bishop h6, which wins straight away. So instead, after castles kingside, queen g4, black generally plays f5 or f6. Now f5 would be met by bishop takes e7, and after queen takes e7, queen g5 is a simple positional move. White would retain a small advantage because of the time it will take black to develop the queen side. Going back to position after castles kingside, queen g4, black can instead play f6, but here white has a surprising move, bishop to d3. The point being, pawn times g5 would allow bishop times h7, king times h7, h to d5 check with a mating attack. If we go back to the position after f6, white can afford to play knight f3 instead of bishop d3. With a possible continuation, pawn takes g5, and now bishop d3, a surprising move. The point being, white already threatens bishop takes h7 check with a crushing attack. To illustrate the challenges the black faces, knight b6 will be met by bishop takes h7 check, king takes h7, queen h5 check, king g8, knight g5 with a mating attack. After knight f3, pawn takes g5, bishop d3. Black can also try g6, but then h5 continues a strong attack for white. After knight f3, pawn takes g5, bishop d3. The computers recommend rook f5 as the best move for black. However, white has another surprising move, knight takes d5, continuing the attack. For example, after pawn takes d5, bishop takes f5 should give white a clear advantage. g6 in this position doesn't help because of bishop to e6 check, and after king g7, pawn takes g5, and already black is threatening rook takes h7 check with a mating attack. Going back to the defining position for the Alekhine-Chatard Gambit, black could try h6, But then after bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, f4, castles kingside, white can play g4. A suggested computer improvement, the point being that after a typical move like f6, pawn takes f6, rook takes f6, queen d2 would allow white to castle queenside and carry out a pawn storm on the king side. Similarly, after f6, pawn takes f6. If the knight captures on f6, white can simply follow with g5 with an attacking position. For example, h takes g5 would allow h takes g5, and if knight e4, knight takes e4, d takes e4, rook h8 check, with queen h5 check to follow. Back to the defining position of the gambit. a6 is another try for black. White can simply play queen g4, already with a threat of bishop takes e7 and queen takes g7. Now, bishop takes g5 has been played a lot more times than I would have imagined, but this gives white an advantage after pawn takes g5 and a move like c5, g6. The point being, neither capture on g6 is any good. f5, queen f4, h6, knight f3 when white should be better. An example variation would be knight to c6, defending the d4 pawn, castles kingside, c3, queen e8 threatening the g6 pawn, and here white has an instructive move, queen to d2, the point being to free the f4 square for the knight. After a continuation like queen takes g6, knight f4, queen e8, the computers give white a clear advantage, and the reason for this is the black queen side. It'll take a couple of moves for black to untangle the queen side. One possible continuation after this is castle queen side, pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, knight b6 to free the queen side, rook h3, a typical attacking move in these positions, bishop d7, rook g3, rook c8, king b1, rook f7, knight h5, and already we see a couple of threats for black to deal with. Knight f6, for example, queen takes h6, for example. Black, of course, could try something like king h7, but then after bishop d3 and a move like queen f8, rook h1, we see that black is faced with too many strong threats. Knight takes g7, queen takes h6 with a crushing attack. Going back to the defining position, we see that after f6, castles kingside, h6, and a6, white gets very good attacking positions. So what happens when black plays the main line c5? In this position, I recommend the simple bishop takes e7, which is better than the alternatives. The point being, the queen takes e7 would be met by knight to b5, which is very strong. After knight a6, knight d6 check will cause black to lose castling right. King f8 and bishop takes a6 would give black a bad pawn structure. After knight b5, instead black could play sacrificially with castles kingside, but after a continuation like knight c7, pawn takes d4, knight takes a8, f6, queen takes d4, knight c6, queen to d2, pawn takes e5, castles queenside, black will eventually win the knight on a8 and has an impressive looking pawn ensemble in the center. Despite the computers giving this as nearly equal, in practice I feel that this should be insufficient compensation for black. Going back to the position after c5, bishop takes e7, black should play king takes e7 when queen g4 is my recommended move. In this position, Black needs to avoid pawn takes d4, because after queen g5 check, king e8 is forced. Queen takes g7, rook f8, knight b5. Queen a5 check can be met by the simple king to d1. And after a move like king d8, knight d6 should be a clear advantage for white. After queen g4, a better alternative for black is to play knight to c6. In this position, I recommend pawn takes c5, the point being after knight takes e5, queen takes g7, rook g8, queen takes h7, and bishop d7. Queen h6 is an improvement on castle's queen side, which has been played several times. The point of the move queen h6 can be illustrated in the following variation: d4, knight e4, queen a5 check will be met by queen d2. When queen takes d2, king takes d2 would be a clear advantage for white. After queen h6, black could try queen a5 instead, but this would be followed by queen d2, and if queen takes c5, knight f3 is a surprising computer suggestion instead of castle's queen side. Instead of knight f3, castle's queen side would allow black strong counterplay after d4, knight a4, queen d5. Going back to the position after queen takes c5, knight f3. The point here is that knight f3 check, g takes f3, knight e5 doesn't really do much, because white can simply castle queen side, and if knight takes f3, queen f4, d4, knight e4, queen f5 to protect the knight, queen d6 check, king e8, knight c5 would be a clear advantage for white. In this position, bishop to c6 will simply be met by knight to a6, threatening knight to c7, check and mate. And if pawn times a6, queen takes c6 check, king e7, bishop takes a6 is simply winning. Going back to the position after knight to c5, queen d5 is also no good, because white can simply respond with queen takes d5, e takes d5, and knight takes d7, king takes d7, and bishop e2 should be a simple technical win for white. To summarize, white obtains good prospects in many variations in the Alekhine-Chatard Gambit declined. Black can hold a balance, but has to play precisely in very complex middle game positions.